The deity of time handed him a single deceptive trial: crush a mere cicada. For a cold-blooded young killer of his caliber, that task should have been an absolute walk in the park. But then the deity whispered, "I want to watch you suffer." Instantly, the world vanished into a pitch black. His memories, his body heat, his hearing, his smell, his vision. Entirely, the sole sensation left in the universe was his tight grip around the shaft of his spear. An ordinary mortal would have crumbled instantly, screaming for mercy. But our guy, he just hoisted his weapon and started slashing blindly into the abyss. He struck out, hitting pure emptiness, / empty air, thrust nothingness. Enduring this agonizing loop, he relentlessly hunted a vibration his deafened ears could not even detect. When reality finally snapped back, the insect was already crushed within his palm. He had slaughtered it 3 lifetimes ago, without even realizing it. The temporal deity gazed down, declaring him the very first mortal to survive without losing his mind, and therefore he had earned the ultimate prize he spent his life hunting for. But to understand how we got here, we have to rewind back to this scrawny kid, freshly dumped into an alien dimension. A suspiciously friendly veteran is giving him the grand tour, dumping lore about the sprawling city, the leveling system, and the mysterious forces of magic. The kid just stares blankly, desperately trying to process the information overload. The veteran flashes a warm, trusting smile, offering to take the classless rookie under his wing. He even promises to buy him a thick, juicy steak, since the boy looks practically starved. The rookie casually nods his thanks and trails the veteran straight into a shady, dimly lit alleyway. There the guy hands over a totally innocent, definitely not spiked beverage. Our innocent protagonist tilts his head back to chug it, or so we thought. Instead, he violently spews the liquid right into the scammer's eyes, casually mentioning that cheap goblin paralytic venom. It might numb the tongue, but it absolutely deep fries the eyeballs. The sleazy con artist thrashes in a blind panic, shrieking and demanding to know how a fresh spawn could possibly figure that out. But our boy is already driving a brutal knee straight into the guy's groin. He snatches the concealed blade from the scammer's coat and executes him on the spot. Wiping the blood, he mutters rule number 1, trust absolutely no one in this trash-tier reality. Oh yeah, we are starting off ruthless. You see, he is actually a time regressor. In his previous life, he was nothing but a garbage C-rank grunt, fighting street dogs for scraps while praying for one massive score. One day he wandered into an ancient ruin and unearthed a mysterious relic left behind by the deity of time. That exact artifact violently ripped his soul out and tossed it back to the exact hour he first spawned in this dimension. But honestly, the rewind felt like a massive joke because he was still stuck with his original fatal flaw. He possessed 0 class, absolutely classless. And after decades of bleeding in the mud, all he ever managed to awaken was a pathetic, bottom-tier bone enhancement trait. Now listen, this is not your typical solo-leveling fantasy, where the main character becomes an unstoppable god in 5 chapters. This pale, edgy kid will eventually make entire armies shiver in fear. Plus, the female cast is extremely generously blessed, so we are eating good today. Snapping back to his reality check, the kid was fuming after realizing his physical traits were identical to his past self. He thought this second chance was a total scam, seeing his stat screen looking perfectly pathetic. However, his mind was a steel trap, holding every single secret from 13 agonizing years surviving the hellscape known as Area. Navigating the gritty streets, he stops directly outside the Healthy Bone Realignment Clinic. He knows this is step 1 in rewriting his destiny. You see, Area summoned all flavors of warriors. You had your spell-slinging mages, your bone-crushing martial artists, and then the utterly average, classless nobodies. Sure, they had the potential to learn anything, but they started off painfully weak, usually getting slaughtered long before they could adapt. That was his original fate, 13 miserable years, scraping the bottom of the barrel as a D-list mercenary, swallowing endless insults and beatings. He eventually died broke, in a ditch, forgotten by everyone. Inside the clinic, a wrinkly doctor intensely examines the boy, who demands a radical skeletal reconstruction surgery. Armed with the bitter regret of his past, Sungmin refuses to repeat his mistakes, determined to forge an unbreakable foundation. His gamble pays off instantly. He successfully secures the entry-level martial skeleton, along with the divine celestial breathing manual. Despite having empty pockets and 0 natural talent, Lee actively feels his muscles knitting tighter as he walks out the door. He just snatched the very first of 3 golden opportunities needed to bypass his doom. This modified skeleton physically rewired his anatomy, acting like an ultimate cheat code for absorbing combat techniques. He officially became patient zero for this master acupuncturist's experimental bone crafting procedure. The catch: the patient had to be totally classless, with a completely blank skill tree. His past self was disqualified instantly, purely because he had hastily locked in a garbage beginner skill. But this time his slate was clean. And considering this brilliant doctor was scheduled to drop dead very soon, almost nobody else would ever exploit this massive shortcut. To top off the massive power spike, he unlocked the authentic celestial cultivation art, an absolute masterclass in generating internal chi, the literal fuel for superhuman martial arts. Furthermore, Sungmin remembered exactly where a top-tier combat manual was collecting dust inside a rundown Genovan. The clueless shopkeeper treated it like useless junk, allowing our guy to cop the legendary scroll for mere pennies. In a single afternoon, he secured 2 of the 3 monumental power-ups he completely missed in his previous life. The final missing piece. He is going to have to survive the blood-soaked. Slated to unlock 12 months down the line, he kept his hopes grounded. After all, this domain restricted entry to absolute beginners with 0 class rankings. That gave him a legitimate window to grind and level up within the walls of Genovis. But before any of that, he needed cold hard cash to secure a roof over his head. His solution? Slaughter some beasts. Inside the local shop, the exhausted merchant barely spared a glance at the scruffy kid standing at the counter. A handful of rugged mercenaries stared eagerly at the gleaming armor and weapons mounted on the walls. Stepping up, Sungmin boldly declares he wants to purchase a set. Scoffing, the merchant questions if the kid even has a dime to his name. To walk out with that gear, he would need to drop a whopping 300,000 Eries. Desperate, the boy begs for a tab, but the request crashes and burns as he gets shoved toward the exit. Yet the old merchant catches the blazing fire in the kid's eyes. Refusing to back down, Sungmin strips off his jacket, offering it up as collateral. He swears it's premium fabric, woven in a highly advanced dimension. The shop owner absolutely loses it, howling with laughter, a noise that quickly irritates the towering mercenaries browsing nearby. Wiping away tears, the merchant growls that he isn't slashing prices, just because some unranked rookie is begging. In his eyes, the punk possessed 0 shame. Surprisingly, he tosses the filthy rags back, finally agreeing to open a line of credit. Truth be told, the hardened vendor respected the kid's sheer audacity to fight tooth and nail. Brat, or not, the old man figured this stubborn survivor wasn't going to bite the dust anytime soon. Who knows? He might just become a profitable regular. Fully strapped with fresh equipment, Sungmin glares out into the pitch-black tree line. Securing that protective plating was an absolute game-changer, even if it plunged him into massive debt. Grateful for the old man's mercy, a wave of relief washes over him. This second chance was already rewriting history. Stepping into the brush, his senses dial up to maximum alert. Crossing the boundary into the treacherous hunting grounds, bitter memories flood his mind. 13 long years ago, he wandered into these exact woods as a completely stripped of armor and lacking a single combat skill. Back then, he was nothing but dead weight. Suddenly, a glowing blue interface chimes, flashing a list of newly acquired stats. Lightning step and ironclad skeleton, and the devastating destruction palm. Shadows lengthen as the sun dips below the horizon. Without warning, rustling leaves break the silence. A grotesque goblin scrambles behind a thick trunk, desperately attempting to conceal itself. But Lee Sungmin is already a step ahead, channeling the deadly soul-chasing spear art. In a single blinding blur, the steel tip shatters the monster's skull in an instant. One shot, one kill. The wretched creature didn't even have a fraction of a second to raise its guard. Catching his breath, the warrior leans against a tree, but a searing agony ripples up his arm. Glancing down at his trembling palm, the grim reality sets in. Executing that lethal thrust required intense friction from his left hand for stabilization, and his fragile, unconditioned skin was severely blistered from the sheer. Yet a cocky smirk crosses his face. He simply resolves to grind his flesh against. This timeline rewind might feel agonizingly slow, but a clean slate is a clean slate. Meanwhile, miles away in a pitch-black cavern, thick crimson smoke, a cloaked figure sits cross-legged on the damp stone, channeling raw, pulsating energy. Swirling arcane magic engulfs his entire form, As his eyes snap open, he senses a bizarre disturbance rippling. Fast forward. Sungmin pushes through the creaky doors of the rundown tavern he called home since dropping into area. The moment he steps inside, a warm, welcoming grin greets him. Jack Atrusi, the grizzled middle-aged tavern owner, leans against the counter, waiting. Without skipping a beat, Sungmin tosses his daily rent onto the wooden, pulling coins straight out of a brand-new dimensional pouch. The burly innkeeper raises an eyebrow, finding it highly suspicious for an unranked rookie to carry. Shrugging it off, Sungmin claims he snagged a killer bargain. Having seen plenty of weird phenomena in his tavern days, the old man drops the subject immediately, pivoting his attention to inspect the freshly harvested goblin fangs. Bartering the gruesome loot, Jack grants him an extra 48 hours in the room. Deep down, the veteran is absolutely blown away by the kid's relentless hustle. He recognizes a raw, undeniable spark of greatness, especially from a nobody who stumbled into Genevis completely empty-handed. 2 brutal weeks had passed, yet the boy was not only breathing, but slaughtering beasts daily, and securing enough profit to keep a roof over his head. Jack mutters that 99% of unranked scavengers wind up dead trying to pull that off. He even wagers the kid might evolve into a legendary powerhouse, like Xenon. Brushing off the massive compliment, the young hunter spins around and trudges up the staircase, muttering about needing to crash after a grueling grind. Clicking the door shut, he slumps onto the mattress, letting Jack's heavy words echo in his mind. He knew the brutal truth. He wasn't born a prodigy. He was just insanely stubborn, dangerously desperate, and clinging to life by a thread. He intensely scans his newly logged combat arts. Despite hitting the cosmic reset button, his brain remained a vault of lethal martial arts knowledge from his previous. Sure, he could flawlessly execute those past moves from pure muscle memory, but his old arsenal was absolute garbage. No matter how many thousands of hours he dumped into those basic strikes, they would never give him the firepower to crush the true apex predators of this world. His only golden ticket was the elusive celestial cultivation art. Stripped to its core, it wasn't exactly earth-shattering, but if fused with top-tier destructive physical techniques, the synergy could elevate him to god-tier status. He makes a hard vow to skyrocket that specific cultivation manual before anything else. Dawn breaks, but just as he's throwing on his gear to step out, Lula, the tavern owner's fiery daughter, blocks the doorway. Crossing her arms, genuine panic flashes in her eyes as she demands to know why he insists on playing Russian roulette with the forest monster. She pleads with him to grab a cushy, risk-free gig in town, but Sungmin's resolve is made of titanium. Cast into this hellscape from an entirely different dimension, spilling monster blood is his only rapid path to wealth. Shaking her head, Lula calls him a total suicidal idiot, practically begging the stuff. Filled with concern, Lula pitched him a safe gig at her family tavern, since her old man already approved of him. But honestly, scrubbing floors and flipping meat just wasn't his style. She just couldn't wrap her head around why he would gamble with death over taking a cozy, secure paycheck. Lee Sungmin kept his mouth shut, his mind heavily drifting toward the grim realities of this second chance. Brushing it off, he tossed over his shoulder that he would return before sundown. Back in his previous timeline, he had clawed his way through simply by surrendering his pride, and he knew perfectly well he could play it. Not this time, though. He vowed to never crawl in the dirt again, swearing to finally snatch the absolute peak of what he truly deserved. And to reach that height, he would cross any line necessary. He craved a destiny far grander than his pathetic past. Just as he marched toward the hunting grounds, the heavy bronze bell of Genevis suddenly echoed across the afternoon sky. That hollow chime signaled only one thing. Fresh meat had just been dragged into this world. Peering into the distance, he sensed a familiar pulsing energy. There stood a young boy, right around the exact same age Sungmin had been during his very first arrival. History was brutally repeating itself. The kid looked completely lost, making him a perfect, clueless target for the local street vultures. In a flash, shady grifters were already shoving that. For a split second, a flicker of pity urged him to step in, but he quickly shoved the feeling down, deciding to mind his own business. But the moment he spun on his heel, he slammed straight into a literal wall of muscle. The guy towering over him was an absolute behemoth. Without even a single second to breathe, he found himself tangled in a classic shakedown, instantly framed for snapping the giant thug's collarbone. Snarling like a rabid dog, the brute smashed a massive fist straight into his jaw, sending Sungmin crashing into the dirt before he could utter a syllable. The brutal thud, playing the victim to manipulate the growing audience, the hulking attacker roared that the scrawny teen had shattered his shoulder, loudly, demanding an eye for an eye. Although visibly baffled, the cold-hearted locals simply shrugged and scattered like roaches. Smirking at his perfect trap, the massive punk prepared to violently snap. Seething with pure rage, Lee Sung-min suddenly connected the dots. This brute and the scammers bothering the kid were all part of the towering meathead looming over him was nothing but a trash-tier warrior, a pathetic third-rate hack who couldn't even distinguish a rib cage from a shoulder blade. In this brutal realm, fighters are strictly categorized by raw power, and third class barely counts as a decent novice. Yet frustratingly, Lee Sung-min had not even clawed his way up to that meager rank himself. Beating this mountain of flesh would require backup, but he knew damn well the cowards roaming Janavis wouldn't lift a single finger to save him. The moment it clicked that the innocent boy was about to be auctioned off into brutal slavery, he threw caution to the wind. He stepped right up, screaming at the kid to drop the poison drink. The young stranger blinked in absolute confusion, but thankfully halted the flask right before it touched his lips. Sung-min desperately prayed that the tainted liquid splashed uselessly onto the dusty cobblestones. Stepping right into Sung-min's path, the boss coiled his legs, gearing up to deliver a crushing blow, but Lee Sung-min wasn't about to go down like a helpless dog. He instantly triggered his lightning step technique, blurring the distance between him and his attack. Seamlessly transitioning, he unleashed his exoskeleton steel break, hitting the overconfident thug with a completely unexpected bone-jarring impact. In a blinding flash, his boot slammed savagely into the leader. His destruction palm and rapid-fire combos definitely hit their mark, but the burly gangster was built like an absolute tank. The brutal exchange forced both fighters to briefly jump back. Despite packing decades of hard-fought experience, his current scrawny body simply could not output the raw damage needed to topple a superior. Hyung-nim did not look threatened in the slightest. The arrogant boss confidently smirked, knowing the much smaller teenager would eventually burn through his stamina. And off to the side, a jittery lackey hissed that all this racket would definitely attract the city patrol. Eyes burning from a safe distance, the newly summoned boy observed the violent brawl with razor-sharp focus. Acknowledging that bare knuckles just would not cut it, Sung-min instinctively ripped his spear from. Out of nowhere, the mysterious kid materialized directly at his shoulder, calmly demanding that Sung-min repeat exactly what he had yelled just a few moments ago. Utterly bewildered by the bizarre timing, Sung-min grunted at the boy to hold on a damn second as he desperately braced his weapon to parry the gang leader's incoming strike. But before the blow even landed, the young boy effortlessly caught the giant's swinging fist with a mere tap. In the very next breath, a terrifying shockwave erupted from the kid, blasting Hyung-nim through the air like a rag doll. I cannot believe these lowly insects dared to treat you so rudely. The shattered bandit violently crashed directly into a groaning that single devastating palm strike, overflowing with pure internal energy, shattered all logic. It wasn't just second class, or even first class. It was on a monstrously. A cold shiver ran down Sung-min's spine as the terrifying truth hit him. This kid standing right beside him, despite sharing the exact same age, was an When the dust finally settled, Sung-min stood completely paralyzed by shock. It suddenly clicked. This seemingly innocent kid had to be the legendary Wijihoyon, the widely feared little celestial demon. The notorious demonic cult was an alliance of ruthless, unorthodox factions, a bloody society where absolute, overwhelming power was worshipped as the only supreme law. The absolute strongest monster ruling, that cult claims the throne as the celestial demon, and his direct heir earns the terrifying title of Young Master, which heavily implied this very boy was the fabled little celestial demon himself. Despite being exactly 13 years old, just like Sung-min, the sheer gap in their power was an uncrossable abyss. In that heart-stopping moment, Sung-min fully realized, even though Sung-min had already connected the terrifying dots, Wijihoyon politely introduced himself anyway. A little while later, as they settled down inside a quiet tavern room, Lee Sung-min, the chilling prodigy, then dropped a massive bombshell. Area wasn't just another continent. It was an entirely different dimension. Entirely. A realm where his almighty demonic cult. Wijihoyon burst into a bright laugh, genuinely amused by this absurd twist of fate, though a faint shadow of lingering anxiety flickered deep within his piercing gaze. Flashing back to the chaotic town square, the deadly prodigy suddenly tilted his head, asking exactly what Lee Sung, failing to see why the detail even mattered now. Sung-min casually explained that he was simply trying to stop him from chugging down a highly toxic goblin. But the fierce little celestial demon absolutely despised being spoken to with such a casual buddy-buddy tone. Swallowing his pride, Lee Sung-min immediately dropped into a deep, respectful bow, rushing to apologize for. Deep inside his ego was screaming in absolute disbelief that he was actually bowing down to a 13-year-old kid. Beaming with arrogant satisfaction, Weiji Hoyeon flashed a highly amused smile, and slowly he mentioned catching a glimpse of the boy's combat skills earlier, only to ruthlessly dismiss those techniques as absolute garbage. He mocked Sung-min's fighting style as downright pathetic, demanding to know who taught him such an embarrassing routine. The regressor stared back, but instead of dragging him down further, the young prodigy dropped a bombshell. He offered to personally mentor him in the martial arts. Stunned, Sung-min simply froze in absolute silence. The little celestial demon guaranteed the boy would grow exponentially under his guidance, but he demanded exactly one catch. Heart-pounding, the regressor tensed up for a brutal A chilling bead of sweat slid down Sung-min's spine. He was entirely blindsided. Ever since he was a little kid, the heir to the infamous demon cult had secretly craved a companion. His ruthless father entirely despised the idea. Yet Hoyeon clung to an old storybook tale, claiming that true comrades could conquer any obstacle. His father fiercely argued that such bonds were strictly for pathetic commoners. The terrifying celestial demon Weiji Hui commanded that his bloodline would absolutely dominate the underworld. Stripped of any normal childhood, the young heir endured a living nightmare of endless, agonizing combat drills. His father remained incredibly heartless, punishing any trace of human empathy as a fatal flaw. In fact, during a single bloody trial, a 10-year-old Hoyeon butchered 50 grown men. Born from the ultimate villain, that horrifying massacre was practically expected. Through it all, the boy's face remained a stone-cold mask. Yet that lifelong hunger for a real bond finally sparked to life the moment he crossed paths with Lee Sung-min, a weary survivor who had traveled back in time. Burdened with crushing expectations from his very first breath, the prodigy's nightmarish training kicked off practically in the cradle. Trapped in that brutal upbringing, he never experienced a shred of normal camaraderie. But despite the incredibly bizarre situation, the unlikely duo forged an official bond of brotherhood. Hoyeon failed to mask the glowing excitement of finally having a genuine buddy. And so, the time traveler, packing the jaded soul of a 28-year-old, partnered up with a 13-year-old kid. Without wasting a second, Hoyeon started drilling Sung-min in the mystic arts of the Violet Dawn, an infamous cult discipline, famous for generating a glowing purple aura. This left the regressor utterly puzzled. He fully expected to inherit the legendary core techniques, now that they were officially buddies. The tiny powerhouse quickly ordered him to drop the formal manners. The second Sung-min switched to casual slang, a massive, satisfied grin spread across the kid's face. It turned out the supreme skills were strictly locked away for the reigning leader and his successor, forcing Sung-min to master these alternative fighting styles instead. Trekking deep into the dense woods, Sung-min suddenly noticed how quickly the days had slipped away. For an entire month, the prodigy had relentlessly hammered the Purple Dawn techniques into his muscles. Now, easily shredding multiple beasts at once, his thirst for raw power only grew wilder. His actual combat tier had skyrocketed to hover between a third and second-rate martial artist, infinitely outclassing his pathetic past life. Even with those massive gains, Hoyeon's savage critiques relentlessly tore apart his mistakes, driving him to the absolute brink. While wandering the overgrown trails, Sung-min prepared to harvest his monster loot. Suddenly, a massive shadow exploded from the brush. A ferocious beast snapped right at his throat. If his reflexes had been even a split second slower, he would be a corpse. Squinting at the threat, he realized he was staring down a hulking orc. Glancing frantically left and right, the bitter truth hit him. He was totally solo and had to slaughter this giant alone. Gripping his weapon, he viciously slammed his spearhead straight into the monster's thigh. In a flash, he ripped a gaping crater through its torso, vaulted forward, and cleanly executed the brute. Catching his breath, he felt the kill was surprisingly until the young master's arrogant, nagging lectures instantly echoed in his mind. Shaking it off, he knelt down to examine the creature's bizarre features, fully aware that greenskins never roamed these specific woods. Out of nowhere, a deep voice clapped for him, praising the kid's terrifying lethal force. A seasoned veteran slowly stepped out of the shadows. It was none other than Moon Hye-yong, the legendary fighter, widely feared as the orchid-destroying sword of the Central District. Completely clueless about the veteran's motives, Sungmin kept his guard up. Gesturing toward the bloody carcass, the swordsman explained. He was actually tracking this exact rogue beast that had been terrorizing the sector. Cutting back to the bustling city, the small monkey Du Sangryong openly doubted if this scrawny kid was cut out for the job. But the veteran quickly shot that down, swearing he had personally witnessed the boy's brutal combat skills and deemed his deadly potential incredibly fascinating. Trusting the swordsman's sharp eye, the infamous Black Rain dagger, Wang Pei, stepped up to formally introduce himself. Next, a bright-eyed spellcaster named Reiner chimed in, proudly representing the Velis Magic Academy. Leaning in with an eager spark, she asked if the rookie had any clue what kind of suicide mission they were actually tackling. A savage horde of orcs had recently constructed a fortress nearby, brutally pillaging human settlements and butchering careless mercenaries. Desperate for a fix, the local guild slapped a massive 20 million Eerie bounty to completely eradicate the stronghold. If they survived the bloodbath, the fortune would be sliced 5 ways. Crunching the numbers in his head, the boy realized his personal slice would sit at around 7 million Eerie, even with that massive bounty on the line. Paranoia still gnawed at Sungmin, but with Woon Hye-yong staring him down, waiting for a verdict, the young spearman finally gave a tense nod. The veteran practically begged, insisting the raid would be a breeze with his spear in the mix. Sungmin took the compliment. Yet a nagging suspicion lingered in his gut. Glancing at the 2 quiet figures huddled nearby, he discovered they were nothing but living backpacks, complete classless nobodies. Hearing the new kid hailed from Murim, the porters instantly scraped the dirt in a deep bow. Their entire existence revolved around hauling gear for leftover scraps of copper. The mage tossed them a few coins, sending the duo scurrying off to fetch some fruit. Rennis casually munched on the crisp apples as the squad marched forward. Before long, the brutal stench of the orc settlement hit them. The scouting math was simple, 50 beasts total, with maybe 30 stepping up to shed blood. Dosangrian scoffed at the threat, branding the monsters as sluggish brutes. He was itching to slaughter them quickly and bag the bounty. The strategy demanded a split. Sungmin stuck like glue to the seasoned swordsman, while the secondary squad provoked the horde. Their goal: scatter the mob and butcher them, one by one. Knowing these beasts guarded their turf fiercely, Rennis whipped up a breeze to waft their human scent straight into the camp. From there they just had to vanish into the shadows, bide their time, and give the mage enough breathing room to charge her explosive magic. Meanwhile, Sungmin and Woon were tasked with sparking a flare to drag the remaining monsters out of their dens. A clean, straightforward blueprint. Sungmin admitted it was a solid tactic for a skeleton crew, even if he secretly preferred a rigged ambush. As the tree line thinned, Woon signaled they had crossed into enemy territory, warning everyone to lock in and grip their weapons tight. The vanguard pushed deep into the danger zone, trailed by the sweaty porter, groaning under the heavy luggage. Stepping onto hostile soil, the spearmen grimaced at the brutal reality of survival for these classless grunts. Staring at the exhaustion carved into the carrier's features, Sungmin saw a haunting reflection of his own pathetic past. Freezing in his tracks, he demanded the guy's name. The trembling porter whispered that he was called Brass. Knowing the upcoming bloodbath would instantly shred a weakling like him, Sungmin offered him a raw ultimatum: flee into the woods or risk his neck here. He knew Woon would not give a damn either way. But the terrified man barely registered the words, violently shaking his head as he gasped that escape would. The sheer terror of the guild's wrath for deserting a raid paralyzed him, leaving him no choice but to pray he survived the crossfire. Creeping up to the perimeter, Woon murmured that they had hit the jackpot. Dodging the hulking patrols, they spotted jagged wooden spikes piercing the forest floor. It was the perfect moment to ignite the flare, but Sungmin threw up a hand, digging frantically into his dimensional pocket. Woon stared in utter confusion. Without a word, the boy dumped out a flask of water, churning the soil to paste, and ordering everyone to slather themselves in thick. It was a gritty camouflage to mask their human stench. Coating his own arms, Sungmin muttered that his master had drilled this survival tactic into his skull. He ordered the veteran swordsman to dive into the dirt. Grudgingly, Woon dropped to his knees and complied. Sungmin even whipped up an extra batch for Brass, just seconds before sparking the crimson signal. Across the clearing, glowing eyes snapped toward the unnatural fire. Out of nowhere, the squad leader pitched a twisted idea. Toss the porter into the open as live bait. Let the beasts swarm him and ambush their blind spots. The moment those words left his Brass nearly choked on his own breath. Pure horror washed over his face, completely unconvinced by Woon's hollow promise of safety. Adding fuel to the veteran casually threatened to execute him for insubordination. He laughed it off as dark humor a second later, leaving a sickening tension in the air as they braced for impact. Sick of the games, the young spearman stepped up to draw first blood, radiating pure grit. Catching his lethal drift, the commander gave a firm nod. The gambit paid off flawlessly, yanking 13 raging monsters from the stronghold and slaughtering them in a seamless rhythm. In the heart of the chaos, Sungmin's spear danced like a deadly phantom, piercing flesh and bone with brutal precision as the green wave crashed against him. Yet amidst the spray of blood, a cynical thought echoed in his mind. Why was he even risking? Snapping back to reality, his eyes locked onto the defenseless porter. Call it foolish pity, or some twisted sense of duty, but he planted his feet to shield the man. There was no deep bond between them, just the haunting mirror of a desperate soul backed against a cliff. The remaining beasts circled him, hungering for a fatal sleep. Channeling years of hellish training, he launched himself back into the meat grinder. His master's ruthless critiques screamed in his ears, keeping his stance rock solid. Weiji Hoyan's golden rule echoed loudly. A spear is meant to dominate from a distance. Gripping the shaft, he unleashed the legendary soul-chasing spear, executing the terrifying third form, lightning split strike. The devastating aura ripped through the encroaching monsters like paper. Right at his flank, Woon Hir-young swung his blade in a frantic, bloody frenzy. But through the dust, a towering, muscle-bound behemoth charged straight for the terror, completely paralyzed and clutching empty air. The porter squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for a shattered skull. Suddenly, Sungmin's silver blade erupted through the beast's chest, stopping the execution. A faint smirk crossed the boy's face, quietly satisfied. As the dust settled, the forest floor was painted crimson, choking on. Without missing a beat, the commander whipped out his dagger, slicing off the grotesque green ears one by one. Every bloody piece of flesh meant cold, hard. Assuming the other squad handled their end of the bargain, Woon chucked his heavy sack over to Brass, barking at the porter to gather up the remaining gear. With their tasks complete, they circled back to link up with the rest of the crew. The humble porter poured out his gratitude to the boy for saving his hide, before scurrying off to pack the bags. Watching him go, the kid couldn't help but note just how raw and genuine that thank you had felt. Over at the rendezvous point, the rest of the squad was waiting for the trio's return. They were caked in thick, grimy mud, but the wave of relief washing over their faces was Phase 1 had gone off without a hitch. The captain even chimed in, bragging that they wrapped up in record time, all thanks to the young warrior's explosive skill. But the real nightmare was just waking up. Without a single warning, a dagger sliced through the air and buried itself deep into Renner's chest. Before the poor girl could even process the shock, the squad's mage violently flipped the script, unleashing her magic right at her own comrades. The surviving members instantly ripped their weapons from their scabbards. The boy whipped his spear around, cleanly parrying the sudden ambush. In that he saw a phantom of his older self, hauling a back-breaking sack of gear, just to scrape by on a few measly cops. In that memory, a massive crowd had swarmed the town square. The man on the chopping block was a ruthless mercenary, hailing from Moram. His crime, butchering every single member of his own party just to hog the bounty for himself. But karma caught up to him. The young boy remembered staring blankly at the traitor's severed head, violently spiked onto a wooden pole. Snapping back to the bloody present, that exact same monster was standing right in front of him. Caught off guard by the kid's lightning-fast reflexes, Woon Hir-young actually threw him a twisted, but the young warrior already had him entirely figured out. After all, he had literally watched this snake get his head chopped off in a previous lifetime. 13 long years had passed, but that gruesome execution was still burned into his brain. Even the captain had to admit the kid's nerves of steel were mind-blowing for his age. Having watched him slaughter those orcs, the traitorous second-rate one arrogantly sneered that the kid was still leagues beneath him. But even knowing he was walking into a brutal meat grinder, the boy flat-out refused to back down. He might have been a lower tier on paper, but the young warrior's footwork, he effortlessly predicted every incoming strike. Weaponizing his spear's massive reach, with razor-sharp, lethal precision. Riding the adrenaline-fueled flow of combat, he finally drew first blood. He made it crystal clear that his season past and Ji Ho-yun's brutal training had forged him into getting a front-row seat to this display of raw talent. Woon Hye-young was genuinely blown away. Still, the veteran killer banked on the kid gassing out before the fight was over. But the boy had a nasty ace stuffed up his sleeve. He had secretly laced the thick mud covering their bodies with a highly potent toxin. This specific venom didn't even need to pierce the bloodstream to do it. With that toxic sludge violently sapping away his stamina, Woon Hye-young was aggressively losing ground in a matter of seconds. Desperate to survive, the traitor violently switched up his game plan. He suddenly lunged wildly to the side, a frantic maneuver that Lee Sung-min instantly recognized as a massive red flag. With violently trembling hands, the treacherous mercenary snatched up the defenseless porter holding him hostage. He maliciously barked that he would snap the man's neck in a single heartbeat. The boy's muscles went rigid, his mind racing to shatter this deadly standoff. Woon Hye-young smirked, entirely convinced that poor Brass had become the young warrior's Achilles' heel. The spearman froze for a split second, yet he adamantly refused to retreat a single inch. Taking Brass hostage was a catastrophically stupid move. He had only shielded the fragile porter because the man was a painful mirror of his own pathetic past life. And now, pure, unfiltered rage was radiating from the boy's eyes. Simultaneously, Woon felt the crippling venom shutting down his nervous system. The kid swallowed down his furious emotions, his burning exhaustion, and his creeping doubt forcing his mind into an icy calm. He knew rushing in recklessly would get them both killed. He had to conserve his explosive energy. One sloppy thrust, and he'd practically hand his life over to the enemy. But if he hesitated a second too long, he violently slammed into Woon's legs, desperately trying to shatter the mercenary's balance. The Brass latched onto the traitor with a death grip, throwing every last ounce of his body weight into the struggle. In a blind panic, the enemy viciously plunged his dagger right into the porter. As an agonizing scream ripped from Brass's lungs, a sick, victorious grin spread across the mercenary's face. But a fraction of a second later, the young warrior was already right on top of him. The treacherous snake completely lost his nerve, blubbering and begging for his pathetic life, only to be ruthlessly executed on the spot. Meanwhile, off in the distance, after an incredibly grueling bloodbath, the horrific ambush was finally over, but the victory tasted like ash. Brass hadn't survived the fatal wound. Lee Sung-min stood silently over the carnage, his blood-soaked spear protruding from the traitor's chest. Once Woon Hye-young and Wang Pei were confirmed dead, their corpses were... That meant they could officially cash in on the massive 35 million bounty. Back at the base, Woo Ji-hyun beamed with joy, seeing her warrior return in one piece, playfully demanding to know what took him so long. Completely drained of life, the protagonist collapsed face first onto his mattress, craving nothing but a brief escape from reality. Yet, the heavy guilt of Brass's gruesome murder was suffocating. If he had possessed just a fraction more speed or power, he might have dragged that innocent man out of hell. Lying there in the dark, his mind violently spiraled over the blood. He felt completely tainted by the slaughter. Out of nowhere, Woo Ji-hyun's voice sliced through the silence, point blank, asking if he had butchered a human. Her demonic senses easily picked up. Lee Sung-min calmly broke down the chaotic ambush, explaining how a second-rate scumbag tried to put him in the dirt, leaving him no choice but to fight for his life. Yet the little demon's piercing gaze didn't waver. She knew deep down he was burying something massive. The burning question gnawing at her was simple. What dark secret was he keeping? Hearing her sharp accusation, the boy slowly pushed himself off the bed. He openly confessed that he didn't even fully grasp the gravity of his own secrets, yet he could physically... He threw the question out there. Did she think it was bizarre that a total nobody like him managed to crush a second-rate martial artist? But Hoi-an totally dodged the question. Staring right at him, she could instantly tell this guy was anything but ordinary. While Wee Ji Ho-yan had been roaming the city streets, she spent her time trying to figure out how this brutal world actually ticked. She witnessed a lot out there, getting a grim reality check on how the bottom-tier classless survived. Most of them were absolutely miserable, scraping by on literal crumbs. For a normal person, squashing a bug is nothing, but taking down even a tiny animal requires serious guts. Throughout all their grueling training sessions, Ho-yan had kept a hawk's eye on the boy. Literally on day one of being summoned, Sung-min plunged straight into the deadly... For him, it was a desperate fight for survival. Sure, maybe the other classless rookies couldn't pull off the same stunt, or perhaps they knew they had to, but simply lacked the nerve to gamble their lives, or take down a living, breathing creature. His friend was completely baffled. How on earth did a 14-year-old classless kid pull off all that bloodshed in a single day? After acknowledging his freakishly fast adaptation, she dropped her second suspicion. Weiji Hoyan flat out stated he was completely talentless. If she demonstrated 10 different techniques, he'd barely grasp 3 or 4 of them. Yet somehow, after just 2 short months, his spear-wielding abilities were light years ahead of a standard beginner. He completely bypassed all those, and his grip on internal techniques was way too refined for a total newbie. That was exactly why she found it so incredibly bizarre. A guy with 0 talent shouldn't be soaking up martial arts at this insane speed. Hoyan's razor-sharp instincts, forged through years of bitter experience, screamed that something massive was hiding behind his deadpan expression. Sungmin froze, totally unsure of how to respond, until Hoyan finally broke the tension, declaring that she absolutely despised liars. A heavy silence choked the room. Lee Sungmin fired back, saying every single person harbors secrets they desperately need to, ripping those secrets out by force. That wasn't how real friends treated each other. The kid was completely caught off guard by that logic. She simply admitted that she carried a dark secret of her own, just like anyone else. She proposed a fair trade of their hidden truths, but he instantly shot the idea down. Not backing down, she dangled an elite-tier martial art in front of him, but knowing his trash-tier talent and pathetic internal energy, he realized the technique would be totally useless. Now completely stumped, the kid scrambled for another way to crack his walls. Finally, she dropped a massive bombshell, offering him 20% of her own internal energy. The protagonist was absolutely paralyzed by the sheer weight of that offer. Deep down, this kid was just burning with intense curiosity about his hidden past. As his one and only friend, she craved to know every single piece of him. Locking eyes with him, she softly confessed that this level of trust was what true friendship actually meant. Slumped on the edge of the bed, Sungmin demanded an ironclad promise from Hoyan. If he spilled the raw truth, she couldn't strike him down. But Weiji Hoyan firmly promised she could never bring herself to murder her own friend. Unbinding her hair and letting it cascade down, she dropped her own bombshell. She was actually a girl. The protagonist's jaw practically hit the floor. She revealed how her fiercely protective father had forcing her to live a double life as a boy just to walk her chosen path. The magnitude of this confession left Sungmin completely speechless. Even after being dragged into this twisted world, she clung to the disguise simply because it had been her reality for so long. This was the ultimate secret she had buried away from the entire world, and now she was handing that trust over to him. Processing the shock, Sungmin awkwardly pointed out they were with the thick tension still hanging in the air, he knew he had to lay his own cards on the table. Scraping together every ounce of his courage, he took a massive shaking breath and confessed that he was a regressor. Weiji Hoyan's eyes blew wide open, though she was clearly clueless about what that word even meant. He broke it down for her. He had literally died, rewound the clock, and dragged all the brutal memories of his past life back with him. Suddenly, his unnervingly polished skills made perfect sense, even if the whole time travel concept sounded like absolute fiction. Then again, in a chaotic nightmare world like this, pretty much anything was on the table. Tilting her head in pure confusion, the girl asked why on earth she would ever want to murder him over something like that. Sure, physically he looked like a 14-year-old kid, but his mind belonged to a grizzled 27-year-old man. He still felt a massive wave of guilt for faking his age, his identity, and his entire history. But to Hoyan, absolutely none of that garbage mattered. She was the one who initially walked up to him, pushed him to master martial arts, and he hadn't manipulated her at all. He merely embraced the hand she extended. Therefore, she didn't have a single reason to end his life, or their powerful friendship. Over those intense 2 months, she had grown to see him as a true ride-or-die companion. And one little time travel secret wasn't about to shatter that bond. In her eyes, that unconditional acceptance was the core of friendship. Her tough exterior melted into a warm, emotional smile as she thanked him for trust. Their connection had officially become unbreakable, forged in the fires of mutual trust and respect. But of course she couldn't resist throwing a playful jab at. She joked that even with a whole second life under his belt, his current power level was still totally pathetic. She had a mountain of burning questions, but those could take a back seat for tonight. Right now she was locked in and ready to channel her precious internal energy straight into him. The protagonist sat there completely floored, realizing she wasn't bluffing at all. Internal energy was the absolute lifeblood martial artists stockpiled inside their own cores. It was the sole fuel that allowed them to pull off mind-bending superhuman miracles. And in this brutal world, there were zero cheat. True strength demanded relentless cultivation. That was the harsh reality, driving warriors to dedicate their entire existence to the grind. The moment Hoyon channeled her ki, she felt the resistance. His internal pathways were a total mess, choked tight with years of toxic buildup. She didn't hold back, though. Pushing through the blockage, she banked on him absorbing a fraction of the surge. If he just anchored himself with the Violet Dawn arts, he could salvage a solid 20%. Slapping her palm against his spine, she flooded his system. Sungmin gritted his teeth, feeling a molten current rip through his core. Drained but grinning, Hoyon wiped the sweat from her brow. "So," she teased softly, "how's the rush?" He couldn't even speak. The sheer blistering heat, that mere 20% dwarfed his entire lifetime of progress from his past. He locked down half of that raw power, and the evolution began immediately. The leftover ki pooled deep within his pathways. All he needed was relentless practice with the Violet Dawn arts to forge that feral energy into a... Exhausted, Hoyon crashed onto the mattress. Watching her breathe, Sungmin wrestled with a heavy thought. Why go to such extreme lengths for him? When he finally whispered the question, Weiji Hoyon flashed a warm, effortless smile. Because we're friends, obviously. Every drop of sweat she shed for him wasn't born from obligation. It was entirely her call. Sinking into the pillows, a deep sense of pride washed over her. But she wasn't done yet. She had one final, lethal trick to pass down. The legendary Supreme Spear of the Nine Heavens. The signature earth-shattering art of the Spear King himself. She knew exactly how far behind Sungmin started. Yet, she was ready to pour her soul into hammering that elite technique into his... Her excuse remained the same. She was just having fun. But the truth ran deeper. He was the first genuine connection she had forged in 13 lonely years. The thought of him dying another pathetic, meaningless death terrified her. Her fierce loyalty hit Sungmin right in the chest. Cupping his cheeks, she locked eyes with him, ordering him to never bow down to a friend. Tracing the nasty bruise on his jaw, she scoffed, still blown away that someone actually managed to clock him. She yanked him in close. A playful spark lit up her eyes as she demanded juicier stories from his previous life. Trading secrets in the quiet room welded their bond tighter than steel. Her curiosity piqued. What kind of monster was she in his original timeline? Sungmin shook his head. He only knew the terrifying campfire tales that she sat unchallenged at the absolute apex of area. In that timeline, she ditched the starting city within weeks of her summoning, completely vanishing off the grid for 3 massive years. Leaning back, she chuckled at the idea. She figured her future self must have been roaming the wild. After all, true freedom was all she ever... Back in the cult, her so-called liberty was tightly leashed by the leader, getting dragged into this dimension. It was the greatest thing that ever happened to her, not just for the escape, but for finally finding a real friend. The atmosphere shifted as she dropped a bombshell she was packing up and leaving in exactly 1 month. The open road was calling her name. Once she drilled that final, godly spear technique into his brain, she was hitting the trails just like her past self did. But right now, the spotlight was on him. What was his next? She probed into his ultimate endgame. The heavy question left him completely stunned, scrambling for words. Flashes of his miserable, blood-soaked past flooded his mind. He was certain of only one fact. He refused to die a loser again. He just craved a decent, honorable life. Hoyon rolled her eyes at the weak response. She was dead set on cracking open the true burning ambition hiding inside Lee Sungmin. Burying his face in the sheets, he confessed he was clueless. Smiling, she promised to hold him to it until he found his real purpose. The interrogation continued. She wanted every gritty detail of his former days. Blushing hard, Sungmin mumbled that his old life was pitifully boring. But as the words left his mouth, reality struck him like a punch. Across 2 lifetimes, he had never made a single genuine connection. Hoyon was literally his first. That quiet night blurred into weeks, and just like that, their 30 days were up. But before she walked out the door, she needed to see the monster she had built. This was the final clash, the ultimate graduation test. He had to lay all his cards on the table. It was time to unleash the beast. Across the dirt, Hoyan flashed a cocky grin, fully aware he still couldn't lay a scratch on her. Sungmin leveled his blade, his gaze turning deadly cold. Then she threw a massive curveball, granting him 20 free shots. The sheer disrespect instantly put him on high alert. He froze, calculating the perfect opener. His mind flashed to the custom-tailored masterpiece she had forged specifically for his hands. She had literally branded the technique with his name. That hit him harder than any martial arts epiphany. It was solid proof that he finally mattered to someone. A terrifying hybrid, fusing the explosive Nine Heavens stance with the lethal venom of the soul-chasing style. Built entirely around his unique rhythm, the showdown ignited. Gripping the shaft, he exploded forward, unleashing his brand-new arsenal. He chained it seamlessly into a vicious soul-chasing thrust. Hoyan didn't even blink. With a ghost-like pivot, she effortlessly let the blade whistle past her. But he didn't stop. He pushed the tempo, striking harder, cutting sharper. His focus dialed to absolute. Shifting his weight, he triggered his second form, the crackling, lightning-splitting pursuit. The amateur who used to fumble his weapon was dead. Now he was a tactician, mastering raw momentum, parrying deadly blows, and choking out his opponent with suffocating pressure. He even weaponized micro-movements, delivering surgical jabs designed to shatter airtight Sure, these spear techniques were rudimentary, but he carved them out through sheer willpower alone. Yet if he ever wanted true mastery, he'd have to grind, day in and day out. Clashing with Hoyan put that evolution on full display. Even then, an invisible wall kept him from tapping into his maximum potential. Biting back his frustration, he channeled raw, explosive ki into every single thrust, exactly as she instructed. A proud smirk crept onto Hoyan's face seeing his progress. Even though her guidance had pushed him straight into the second-rate realm, she effortlessly parried his onslaught with nothing but her right hand. This was the aura of a bona fide grandmaster. While he gasped for air and threw everything he had, she remained as calm as a gentle breeze, shutting down his. Refusing to quit, he lunged forward again. Slash after slash, stab after stab. She swatted them away like mere flies. 19 blistering strikes, all neutralized by that single, unwavering palm. As his final thrust deflected off into the air, the bitter taste of defeat washed over him. Wait. A final desperate gambit caught her slipping, bringing the lethal steel just inches from her cheek. A triumphant grin flashed across his face, but in the blink of an eye she dissolved into thin air. Checkmate. She materialized right at his back, cementing his utter loss. Yet instead of mocking him, Hoyan showered him with praise, finally acknowledging housing that much potent inner ki meant Sungmin was practically built for the martial path. Hell, without even realizing it, his instincts had already locked onto her terrifying presence before she moved. That was a sensory feat usually reserved for absolute prodigies. She poured so much faith into his abilities, boldly declaring that his spearmanship would one day shake the heavens. Her words carried the weight of someone peering a decade into the future. Sure, sweeping the floor with him took zero effort on her part, but genuine joy radiated from her smile anyway. He had completely shattered her initial expectations. Then she dropped a bombshell. They would reunite in exactly 10 years. Just 30 days prior, she had pressed him about his ultimate life ambition, leaving him utterly speechless. So she offered herself as the target. A warrior without a purpose is just a drifter, waiting to die. Her ultimatum was crystal clear. Survive for 10 years. Crawl your way up and come back strong enough to crush. Sungmin froze, self-doubt immediately poisoning his thoughts. He argued he was a talentless nobody, miles away from a freakish genius like her, who grew up chugging mythical elixirs. Their starting lines weren't even in the same universe. That suffocating inferiority complex from his previous miserable life was wrapping its icy fingers around his throat once more. Hoyan didn't hide her disgust. She scowled, visibly irritated by. She despised that pathetic self-pity, and her biting insults finally sparked a raging fire in his eyes. He barked back that he was dumped into area with absolutely zero advantages. No innate talent, no wealthy backers, just a desperate kid wrestling wild boars in the bloody mud, scraping by like street trash, until he met a Hoyan instantly shot back, reminding him that he had just absorbed legendary mystic arts, and skyrocketed to a second-rate martial artist in a mere 90 days. The universe handed him a miraculous do-over, yet he still cowardly refused to aim for the stars. She desperately hammered reality into his thick skull, but suddenly Hoyan stepped back, catching the raw, unadulterated fury boiling over in his expression. Sungmin was practically pulling his hair out. How the hell was a 7-year-old child giving him a savage reality? Taking a deep breath, he swallowed his pride, accepted the insane gauntlet, and locked her in as his ultimate milestone. But then he awkwardly promised to drive a spear straight through her heart, which instantly terrified Hoyeon. That was definitely buddies don't murder each other. Once the fiery tension dissolved, he realized how psycho that sounded, and furiously blushed in humiliation. Seizing the opportunity, Hoyeon mercilessly poked fun at him, leaving the poor guy a flustered, annoyed mess. The ironclad pact was sealed, 10 years until their next clash. Flashing a mischievous grin, she purred that she couldn't wait to taste his spear. Sungmin choked on his spit. That phrasing sounded ridiculously sketchy. Even as a literal child, she thrived on tormenting him. Sure, there was a massive age gap between them, but she weaponized it for laughs anyway. Stepping dangerously close, she boxed him in and boldly proclaimed that in a decade, she'd be a fully blossomed woman. So he wouldn't have a single excuse to complain then. Calming down, Sungmin carved 3 absolute directives into his mind. First, survive. Second, exploit every single cheat code. As Hoyeon slung her travel bundle over her shoulder, they finally exchanged their bittersweet goodbyes. He swore on his life that they would cross paths when the 10-year mark hit. He was genuinely counting down the days, which brought him to his third most crucial objective, absolutely refusing to die before cashing in on that promise. Looking her dead in the eye, he vowed to stay breathing. For the first time ever, he actually had a burning purpose and someone worth fighting for. With that, the 2 unlikely comrades turned their backs and walked into their set. During his brutal stint in Janavis, Lee Sungmin secured 3 monumental treasures: the reconstructed martial skeleton, the legendary true celestial cultivation technique, and finally, the infamous tournament of the Classless, an underground blood sport exclusively for unawakened nobodies. Exactly 10 months after Hoyeon vanished from his life, Janavis hosted the brutal gauntlet once more. By this point, Sungmin had clawed his way into the first-rate martial tier, turning the so-called fierce competition into a total cakewalk. His grand prize, a hyper-rare secret, a potion designed to massively supercharge a warrior's inner ki. He chugged the fiery liquid on the spot, though honestly, next to the mythical stuff Hoyeon, it felt like drinking a cheap energy drink. Still with that final power-up absorbed, Sungmin knew he had squeezed every last drop of value out of it. It was time to pack up and get the hell out of Dodge. Making his way toward the city gates, he bumped into his old acquaintance Hans, the street peddler. Hans beamed, throwing congratulations his way, before launching into his usual sales pitch. But the cheerful banter quickly shifted into a heavy farewell once Sungmin dropped the news of his departure. The vendor gave a knowing, bittersweet smile. His eyes swelled with a mix of fatherly pride and mild sorrow, having watched this scrappy kid hustle from deep down. Hans firmly believed this rugged, classless underdog was going to tear up the world outside those walls and survive whatever hell. Before Sungmin could take another step, Hans tossed him a parting gift, a slightly worn second-hand dimensional pouch, packing 50% more inventory space than his busted old one. Sungmin stared in disbelief. Why would Hans give away such a priceless item? Hans simply waved it off, insisting that free things should be taken without question. Besides, the battered pouch wouldn't fetch a single coin at the market. It was a parting present. Once Sungmin carved his name into the world, he could pay the vendor back 100-fold. The humble merchant only asked for one thing in return. He wanted the boy to never forget the lowly stall owner who gave him a push when his journey. Bowing his head in deep gratitude, Sungmin offered a final thank you and turned away. He retraced his steps back to the familiar tavern he called home. But before he could slip away, Lula, the tavern keeper's daughter, blocked his path. One glance was all she needed to piece together his departure. The painfully spotless quarters gave it away immediately. Pouting, she reminded him that scrubbing the floors was strictly her duty. A wave of warmth washed over Sungmin as he reflected on his peaceful days under their roof. Lula understood the harsh truth. Travelers like him never anchored themselves to this town forever. Drifters always vanished eventually, and she had grown numb to the cycle. Yet hearing him say the actual words shattered her tough exterior, leaving a heart. The sudden reality of his exit was too much to swallow. Panic and sorrow clashed in her chest. Before he could take another step, she screamed out a bitter curse, wishing for him to meet in some forgotten wasteland. Spinning on her heel, she stormed down the hall in a fiery rage. Jack, watching the entire dramatic explosion unfold, could only scratch his head at the baffling complexities of the female mind. He offered a weary sigh and a quick apology, blaming her fiery temper on foolish youth. Brushing off the insult with a gentle smile, Sun Min revealed the quiet wisdom of an old soul trapped in a young body. Seeing this, the burly tavern owner handed over a faded mantle from his glory days. Woven with warming spells and blade-enhancing enchantments, the rugged fabric hid incredible power beneath its modest exterior. Sun Min accepted the heavy garment with immense gratitude. Laughing, Jack advised him to visit a tailor, as the massive cloth swallowed the boy whole. His rough voice softened as he called Sun Min the finest unmarked traveler to ever cross his threshold. Blinking away heavy tears, Jack choked out a final plea for the boy to survive the brutal world. Pulling the oversized fabric tightly around his shoulders, Sun Min stepped. His boots ground to a sudden halt. Frantic footsteps echoed on the cobblestone behind him. Just as he crossed the threshold, Lula's desperate voice shattered the noise. He spun around to find her hunched over, gasping wildly for air. Her lungs burned from the mad dash. Waiting a tense second to catch her breath, she hung her head in shame, furiously retracting every hateful syllable she had spat in the lobby. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down her as she confessed her true desire. She begged him to survive, to live an impossibly long life. Sun Min's eyes widened. He couldn't believe she had chased him down the street just to pour her heart out. With trembling lips, she prayed for his safety, demanding that if the cruel world ever broke his spirit, he must drag himself back to this very town. A soft, genuine smile, deeply moved by her clumsy but pure affect. Blushing furiously, she finally admitted the truth. Somewhere between his arrival and departure, her view of him had shifted. The unfamiliar flutter in her chest confused her, but she realized she had fallen for the quiet drifter. Her brave confession hung heavily in the air. A profound silence stretched between them, finally broken that he had sensed it all along. Terrified that the wilderness would claim his life, she trembled. He softly ordered her to wipe away her worries. They exchanged their final farewells, but the crushing weight of reality finally snapped her control. Lula collapsed into a sobbing mess. In his previous miserable existence, Sun Min had burned 3 grueling years just to scrape through Genos. This time, he dominated the region in a single year. In his past life, he dragged himself out of this place with nothing but scars and regrets. Now his mind brimmed with precious moments he swore to protect. Throwing one final glance over his shoulder, he questioned if his boots would ever touch the soil of Area again. Burying the thought, he marched toward the horizon, clutching tightly to his promise of survival. Lee Sun Min arrived at the ominous peaks of Mount Mush at a staggeringly young age. To push forward, he had to embrace a brutal restriction. Survival demanded absolute endurance. His mind drifted back to Wei Ji Hoi Yun. He remembered her asking to set a reunion point, completely lost when it came to navigating this alien world. Needing a massive, unmissable landmark, he locked in Behenger. 9 long years still separated them from that fated reunion, but a burning question haunted his present steps. What was his first move? Sprinting blindly toward Behenger made 0 sense. The thought of hoisting a sword for coin crossed his mind. But plunging back into the mercenary underworld was just a replay of his pathetic past. He refused to walk that doomed trail a second time. He desperately needed a crucible to forge his strength. That hunger led him straight to Mount Mush, the sacred domain ruled by Area's god of suffering and agonizing trials. Legends whispered that bleeding on these slopes multiplied a warrior's growth by hundreds. Plus, the towering peak was right in his backyard. The decision was instant. Scaling the treacherous trails, he threw himself into hellish training, locked under the crushing curses bestowed by a local priest. He accepted 2 brutal vows. The first curse manipulated gravity itself. His bones, his rags, and every single scrap in his pack suddenly weighed a ton. A simple loaf of bread dragged his arms down like a block of solid iron. But the second trial was pure psychological torture. The second his teeth pierced his stomach violently rebelled. A repulsive flavor exploded across his tongue, forcing him to vomit violently onto the dirt. This was his second agonizing restriction. The divine magic warped his taste buds into a living nightmare. His palate wasn't numb or deadened. Far worse, every bite transformed into pure rot. The horrific curse didn't stop at flavor. It twisted the texture, making a simple meal feel exactly like crunching down on a fat, squirming cockroach. A cold shiver of panic gripped his spine. Starvation and dehydration suddenly felt like a very real threat. For a fleeting, desperate second, did he really need to torture himself like this? He could easily abandon the mountain march to Behanger and carve out a decent living swinging a blade. Smashing through the B-rank barrier would be a breeze. That alone was a paradise compared to his miserable first life. Yet the striking image of Weiji Hoyan refused to leave his mind. Fueled by her memory, he snatched up the cursed bread and shoved it past his lips. Pure gag-inducing filth coated his mouth, but he furiously chewed and swallowed. Screaming mental curses at Mush for designing such a twisted game, he swallowed his disgust and embraced the suffering. High above the agony, a divine whisper drifted through the wind, the goddess amusedly labeling him a sudden surge of raw energy jolted through his veins. He whipped around, scanning the empty woods, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. 7 agonizing days crawled by. The brutal elements battered him relentlessly, yet he pushed on, stalking the brush until he locked eyes with a lone deer. Gripping his ring tight, he melted into the shadows, biding his time before launching his ambush. But as he closed the distance, the creature's innocent gaze completely paralyzed his killing intent. He stood there frozen in hesitation, watching his meal dart into the thicket. Lee Sung-min's brutal mountain trial was slowly crushing his spirit, leaving him wondering just how much more torment he could endure. Utterly drained, he dropped his spear and stared blankly ahead, questioning his life choices. Starving and stripped of proper nourishment, he was barely clinging to life on nothing but stale bread and water. This unforgiving peak demanded absolute self-reliance. He had to scavenge for his own meals, craft his own clothes, and build his own shelter, all while suffocating. The climate violently swung between freezing cold and scorching heat, while the local beasts prowled with terrifying speed and monstrous strength. His crushing physical burden made hunting an absolute nightmare, and even when he scored a kill, his vanished sense of taste turned every bite into ash. Despite this hell, he planned to endure this torture, yet barely 7 days in he was already teetering on the edge of collapse. Lost in his bleak thoughts, the sudden chilling presence of a stranger snapped him back to reality. A mysterious woman stepped out of the wilderness. He had never laid eyes on her before, his mind racing to figure out her identity. Thankfully, an absolute law governed this mountain, strictly forbidding martial artists from shedding each other's blood. He exhaled slowly, realizing he might actually be safe. However, this enigmatic stranger suffered a curse of her own. It didn't take long for Lee Sung-min to piece it together. She was bearing the brutal penalty of silence. Suddenly, the very same deer he had let slip away was tossed at his feet stone dead. Grabbing a nearby branch, the silent stranger began carving words into the dirt, using Arya's common tongue. She revealed she had been tracking his pathetic struggles for days, knowing full well he was practically begging for a Grim Reaper's visit if she didn't step in to save him. Relieved but deeply paranoid, he narrowed his eyes and demanded to know her price. Her answer was simple. She wanted absolutely nothing, offering her aid out of pure kindness. This bizarre savior completely took him under her wing, providing everything he needed. She playfully dubbed herself nothing more than a passing good Samaritan. Every single time danger reared its ugly head, she swooped in like a guardian angel. Finally, he asked for her actual name, and her written reply left him absolute. She was none other than Baek Sogo, a legendary icon from his previous life. Revered across the realms as Baek Sogo, the Lightning, her blinding speed was the stuff of absolute myth. But crossing paths with a future titan wasn't what made his blood run cold. He carried a dark secret, he knew, that exactly 8 years from now, she was destined to be slaughtered by the terrifying little celestial demon Weiji Hoyan. Here on Mount Mush, martial artists were slapped with fresh, agonizing curses every 6 months, bound by the strict rule against killing one another. Lee Sung-min racked his brain desperately, trying to piece together how such an unstoppable force like Baek Sogo could ever meet her demise, wondering if she perished in some deadly Right beside him, the silent warrior studied his face intently. He practically jumped out of his skin when she abruptly shifted her weight. Dragging her slender fingers across a flat stone, she sketched out a quick message, genuinely concerned that he was already starving again. Despite her awe-inspiring martial prowess, her cruel curse completely sealed off her telepathic sound transmission. But as he scrutinized her movements, a chilling realization: after surviving this hellish peak for 18 grueling months, her latest penalty had completely severed all sensation in her left arm, leaving it utterly deadened. Just like him, she was surviving under crippling chains. Yet Baek Sogo looked at him with deep pity, heartbroken that he was robbed of the simple joy of tasting a warm meal. Burning with curiosity, he asked what horrific penalties the other survivors were enduring. Taking the hint, she decided it was time to drag him along and introduce him to the remaining veterans, who had survived this torturous training ground for over 6 months. Before he could even blink, Bek Sogo vanished from his sight like a crack of blinding lightning. Jaw-dropping in shock, he marveled at how anyone could possibly rival that godlike velocity. Even if he wasn't chained down by his crushing weight curse, his sluggish body couldn't dream of moving that fast. The harsh reality slapped him in the face. He desperately needed to level up his footwork. Eager to learn, he boldly asked if she could take him on as her student, only to immediately backtrack with an awkward chuckle, claiming it was just a bad joke. Instead of laughing, she effortlessly hoisted him up with a single arm. Deciding he was way too pathetic to keep up, she simply strapped him to her back like a sack of potatoes. Whoa, hold up a sec, he panicked, desperate to process the situation, but she completely ignored his frantic pleas and blasted off into the forest. The moment they crashed into the survivor camp, a gut-wrenching foul stench assaulted his nostrils. It was coming from Scarlet, a legendary future Grand Mage, whose sickening curse strictly forbade her from ever bathing or changing her filthy rags. Then there was Doc Baejun, the man fated to become the infamous Phantom Sword, whose curse had completely hollowed out his vision, leaving him utterly blind. As for Bek Sogo, she was enduring the agonizing loss of her left eye. A chill ran down Lee Sung-min's spine as he realized he was standing right in the middle of absolute legends. Titans he only... These unpolished diamonds were destined to become unstoppable forces across area, but right now, they were just nameless nobodies. Breaking the ice, Scarlet bluntly demanded to know what kind of curses he was hauling. When he casually confessed he kicked off his hellish trial with 2 brutal penalties, she scoffed in sheer disbelief, openly placing bets on how fast he'd break. The blind swordsman Doc Baejun chimed in calmly, stating that for a madman craving absolute power on Mount Mush, stacking 2 curses on day 1, the seasoned warrior saw the burning hunger in the kid's eyes, knowing he was willing to obliterate his own limits at any bloody cost. Lee Sung-min nodded fiercely at every single word, a dark resolve radiating from him that sent an... Doc Baejun gravely explained that while a flood of eager challengers constantly swarmed this cursed peak, only 4 absolute monsters had managed to survive the last 6 months. Flashing a knowing grin, the blind man promised he'd be closely monitoring the kid's chaotic journey. He then dropped a massive bombshell the legendary Bek Sogo herself had also kicked off. After wrapping up the introductions, the group headed back. But her earlier words lingered. Only 4 martial artists had survived this grueling peak for over 18 months, which meant a 5th person was lurking around, a guy named Flam. Just hearing that name made the others tense up. Old man Doc Baejun had given a strict warning. Keep the kid far away from Flam. The guy was pure danger. Sung-min could not wrap his head around why everyone dreaded this lone straggler, but he brushed it off. The days blurred together, and after 4 grueling months of literal hell, his power had surged. The mountain's curses clamped down harder, stacking invisible boulders on his shoulders and turning every bite of food to ash in his mouth. Yet his growth was undeniable. By the end of those 4 months, his violet dawn aura ignited, breaking right through to the 3rd star level. Every thrust of his blade grew razor sharp and devastatingly heavy. Mount Mush was a nightmare, but the payoff was absolute. Under the blazing sun, he relentlessly drilled the supreme ring of the 9 heavens spear art. Under the moonlight, he meditated, circulating his violet dawn energy. He swallowed the agony, treating it like a faithful companion. Even when his bones screamed and threatened to shatter, he embraced the brutal destiny he had carved out. His muscles coiled and expanded with raw power, ripping against the seams of his tight clothes. Then out of nowhere he spotted a fresh face, a kid, looking to be exactly his age, staring him down with an amused, piercing gaze. The stranger looked genuinely entertained by the ferocious spear forms he had just witnessed. Leaning casually nearby, the newcomer smirked, saying he had never stumbled across another teenager wandering this hellish peak. He flashed a smile and dropped his name, Flam, the exact phantom everyone was terrified of. Tilting his head, Flam casually asked for the name of the boy swinging that lethal weapon. Meanwhile, miles away, Scarlet sat cross-legged, weaving intricate spells, her mind drifting to the terrifying reality of absolute. The old master had once warned them. Flam's innate talent was so monstrous, so suffocating, that he practically chuckled while looking down at the rest of humanity. That was the exact reason they told Sungmin to avoid him at all costs. Just standing in his shadow was enough to drag a normal person into bottom. The old man's dire warning echoed in his skull as he stiffened nervously, whispering, "I am Lee Sungmin." Flam's grin widened, instantly catching on that his dark reputation had preceded him. Trying to break the tension, Sungmin quickly turned his back, grumbling that he had to get back to his spear drill, not waste time gossiping. Deep down, Sungmin was practically scoffing. Was this cocky kid really the ultimate prodigy? Thinking the freak was finally leaving, Sungmin resolved to ignore the distraction. But the arrogant brat refused to back off, trailing right behind him, firing off endless annoying questions. Frustrated, Sungmin snapped that he was going back to practice, only to realize his hands were completely empty. His spear had he whipped around. Flam was casually twirling the heavy weapon, openly baiting him. The twisted, psychopathic smirk plastered on the kid's face sent chills down it. In the martial world, letting an enemy strip your weapon is the ultimate humiliation. Yet before the boiling rage could even set in, Sungmin was just utterly bewildered. Flam lazily shrugged, tossing out a remark about borrowing it for a quick second. Without missing a beat, he dropped into a stance and perfectly mirrored Sungmin's. Wielding the supreme balance of the 9 heavens, the boy unleashed a brutal strike, a complex move he had memorized flawlessly just by watching. It was the exact lightning-fast sequence Sungmin had used to slice through a massive tree trunk. Right before his eyes, Flam ruthlessly replicated the lethal art that Sungmin had bled for months to master. Whistling at the sheer destruction he just caused, the prodigy casually praised the technique's power. Sungmin stood paralyzed. His blood ran cold. This monster had flawlessly with a single glance. Flam just threw his head back and laughed, utterly delighted, to rub his overwhelming superiority in the ordinary boy's face. Humiliation scorched through Sungmin's veins like acid. Meanwhile, Flam sighed, genuinely baffled as to why pathetic weaklings tortured themselves on this peak, especially when he could crush them without breaking a sweat. Shaking his head, the boy muttered that none of these so-called experts even came close to his level. Utterly thrown off, Sungmin braced. Flam scoffed, calling powerhouses like Baek Sogo Scarlet, and the old master nothing but total freaks. He proudly bragged that he could rip off any warrior's ultimate moves on sight. Hell, even the kid himself didn't know why he was blessed with such an absurd cheat code. In Sungmin's eyes, this arrogant prodigy blazed like a blinding sun, completely out of reach. How in the world could a talentless grunt ever hope to stand on the same stage as these freaks of nature? It was a harsh slap in the face compared to Hoi-Yan. She was brilliant, sure, but she never threw her genius in his face, hiding her godlike potential behind a humble, everyday smile. Changing the subject, Flam boldly demanded to know what curse the mountain had slapped on him, casually flexing that he was carrying. He even burst out laughing openly, trashing the curse of humility, which forced Sungmin to physically take a step back from the psycho. Bored with his toy, but Sungmin completely ignored it. He was utterly sick of this guy. A suffocating wave of fury, sheer embarrassment, and crushing powerlessness swallowed him whole. The prodigy blinked, totally oblivious to the venom in Sungmin's eyes. He even had the nerve to suggest the weakling should just pack up and flee the mountain, tossing out a cruel remark that the kid had already hit his pathetic limit. Now drawing blood on this sacred ground was a massive taboo. Yet as Sungmin blindly lunged forward, Flam didn't even flinch. He just laughed. He sneered, calling out the bluff, claiming the loser only dared to swing his fists because the guaranteed absolutely no one would actually die here. Right at that explosive moment, Baek Sogo faded from the shadows, silently watching throwing his hands up in mock surrender, whining that he was just taking the rusty old spear for a friendly spin. And honestly, Sungmin was blowing things entirely out of proportion. Flam had praised the spear technique as an absolute masterpiece, but bluntly added that our hero completely lacked the raw talent to wield it. The more god-tier the martial art, the more impossibly. That meant Sungmin faced an agonizingly long road ahead. Up on this brutal mountain, suffering was currency. The harsher the restriction, the heavier the blessing Goddess Mush bestowed. Flam's advice was incredibly dangerous. If you want to skyrocket your growth, you have to drag yourself straight to the absolute brink. But before he could spill another word, his own divine gag order clamped his mouth shut. Standing right behind him, Baek Sogo watched, genuinely blown away by his sheer audacity. The damage, however, was already done. Sungmin's mind was instantly made up. Surging with desperate resolve, he sprinted straight toward the temple. Sogo panicked, frantically trying to scream his name, but her own restriction violently choked her words. That heavy word, talent, echoed relentlessly in her skull, completely shattering her own pride. Meanwhile, the desperate young man screamed out for Goddess Mush. His crippling inferiority complex was swallowing him alive, mutating from bitter frustration into bottomless despair. Answering his desperate plea, the goddess materialized right before the mortal who summoned her. White-knuckling his spear, he boldly demanded yet another brutal restriction. Suddenly reality warped, throwing Lee Sung, the ethereal entity he summoned, floated right in front of him. This was Mush, the absolute goddess of prohibitions. He was standing right inside her sanctuary. He cautiously asked if she was the real deal, and she confirmed it. The deity had actually answered his desperate cry. Tilting her head in sheer curiosity, she asked if he seriously wanted to chain himself down even more. He already suffered under the loss of taste and a crush two utterly agonizing burdens. Yet he braced himself to shoulder a third. Mush stared at him, deeply, skeptical of his insane death wish. After all, his soul was heavily branded with the scent of a time traveler, a regressor, and a deity can easily read the tangled threads of a mortal's destiny. Every living creature is doomed to perish, and cheating that universal law violently twists the very fabric of fate. Only the absolute anomalies, who shatter their pre-written destiny. He was absolutely nothing like them, yet somehow, he had still shattered cause and effect, clawing his way back to the past after taking his last. Every single life is chained to cause and effect. Dodging the Grim Reaper was a massive crime against nature, and his soul was doomed to pay a catastrophic karmic debt. He would walk away clean while he was alive, but the second he died, he would be tortured for millions of hours. That was the horrifying price tag for cheating the universe. But our hero didn't look even remotely fazed by the threat of hell. Back in reality, Sogo was staring at him, absolutely shattered by his reckless stunt. It instantly clicked for her. He had actually taken on a third handicap, even with two nightmarish curses already crushing him. Shivering violently, he realized he was terrifying her. Her eyes went wide at his next words, and she nervously choked out a question, demanding to know exactly what he had sacrificed this time. He calmly confessed that he was now cursed with the prohibitions of heat and dreams. Sacrificing your senses and tampering with the abstract were the most lethal limits of all. The first curse instantly sucked every ounce of warmth right out of his bones. Blazing fires and scorching sunlight would never warm him again. The second curse hijacked his sleep, trapping him in an endless loop of his most agonizing, traumatic memories. The tragic loss of his parents, his suffocating childhood terrors, the crippling anxiety, every single ounce of his trauma. Sleep was no longer a sanctuary, but a torture chamber. Sogo stared in pure horror, fully grasping the sheer insanity of his actions. This was beyond reckless. Even if this skyrocketed his power, the toll on his mind would be catastrophic. As she desperately tried to talk some sense into him, the young man just gave her a quiet, heartbreaking look. He flat out admitted that he was utterly devoid of talent. Despite carrying such agonizing handicaps, his progress was still crawling at a pathetic pace. Witnessing that crushing wall between raw effort and natural genius, Sogo found herself wondering what kind of man was truly hiding underneath all that grit. Lee Sung-min was chasing a dream thousands of miles out of his league, and Flam had just handed him the brutal blueprint to actually reach it. If he ever wanted to breathe the same air as those god-tier geniuses, in that heavy moment, the gravity of his choice finally clicked for her. A thick silence swallowed them both. Then a soft smile crept onto her face as she realized the terrifying scale of his ambition. Sogo was fighting to become the absolute strongest in the world herself, so she completely resonated with his hunger. The boy just blinked at her, completely lost. He suddenly remembered shamelessly begging her to teach him her footwork techniques a while back. She had brushed it off as a total joke back then, but right now, she was dead serious about passing it down. She handed over an elite secret manual called Shadowless Soul Flight. It wasn't just footwork. It was a rare mystic art packing every single secret she knew about ultimate speed. Thumbing through the ancient pages, he was absolutely paralyzed by its brilliance. Even Sogo wasn't entirely sure why she was handing over her most prized possession, but she knew one thing for sure. This kid was never going to throw in the towel. From this second forward, he was strictly told to call her senior sister. Flashing him a warm smile, she gently confessed that she genuinely cared about him, and wanted to watch his back. Plus, she always prided herself on being the kind of person who pulled others out of the mud. With that settled, our fiercely driven hero dove straight back into his hellish training. Keeping the burning memory of Ouija Hoyon locked in his mind, he flawlessly chained the supreme spear of the 9 heavens right into his soul pursuit strike. By the time he hit the 5th stance, devastating streaks of lethal lightning were already violently tearing through his mind. He envisioned the sheer devastation his flesh and bones would endure, clashing against Ho-Yan. And that was with over a decade of grueling blood, sweat, and tears under. Yet conquering the little celestial demon remained an impossible pipe dream. Ultimately, Ho-Yan coldly declared that passing her martial arts down to him was a massive blunder, and completely washed her hands of him. Wielding her overwhelming aura, she ruthlessly reclaimed every ounce of power she had gifted him. After shattering his core to pieces, his days as a martial artist were permanently vaporized. As she turned her back and faded into the distance, Sung-min screamed out for his only friend in pure desperation. Every single agonizing step tore his muscles apart, flooding his veins with absolute terror. Sung-min Lee snapped awake from that suffocating nightmare of Ouija Ho-Yan. He sat there completely soaked in cold sweat, with his heart hammering against his ribs, before it finally clicked it was just a phantom memory. Releasing a heavy sigh of relief, he fought to calm his violently trembling hands. That was when his eyes locked onto the mysterious girl looming over him. Jumping out of his skin, he glared at Scarlet, who had been quietly stalking his sleep. She wasted no time bringing up his latest reckless stunts, specifically piling on even more punishing restrictions. Her suffocating proximity put him instantly on edge, and the pungent stench radiating off her actually burned his retinas. Dripping with heavy sarcasm, she shredded his life choices, crushed his fragile hopes, and bluntly predicted his upcoming funeral. His stomach was already churning from her lethal body odor when Jun suddenly stepped onto the scene. They had not tracked him down for small talk. They were here to throw him a lifeline. He scrambled to figure out why this bizarre duo was suddenly crashing his misery. Scarlet rolled her eyes and bluntly repeated that they were here to drag Sung-min. The silent woman had dispatched them, heavily armed with mystical artifacts. The second it clicked that Baek So-go was pulling the strings, everything made perfect sense. Scarlet tossed over a stack of arcane scrolls, packed with high-level incantations ready for him to. Armed with these cheat codes, weaving spells would become an absolute breeze. Jun, on the other hand, brought a much more brutal brand of assistance, forging the kid's fragile body into a weapon capable of surviving those agonizing restrictions. His eyes burning with fierce resolve, the young warrior braced himself for hell. Right then and there, the duo threw him into the meat grinder. Scarlet drilled 4 distinct mystical arts into his brain, kicking things off with a mental purge. This spell acted as a psychic scrub, washing away the toxic sludge those vicious nightmares left behind. The next incantation was a raw, unpolished buff, designed to rapidly bulk up his physical specs. That made it an absolute lifesaver for surviving. The soul-crushing gravity curse. While trading brutal blows with Jun, he triggered the 3rd spell to burn away his deep exhaustion. It acted like a shot of pure adrenaline, instantly refilling his gas tank. But abusing the trick would cannibalize his own lifespan and violently backfire. Even so, if he wanted to crawl out of this living hell in one piece, he had to bite the bullet. Yet, despite stacking all those buffs, his clash against the sightless Grandmaster was an absolute massacre. He crumbled to the dirt in less than 100 seconds, spitting blood. Sung-min swore he would bridge the gap next time. Without warning, a searing wave of supernatural heat violently convulsed through his entire nervous. Jun immediately stepped in, striking precise pressure points across the boy's torso to forcefully regulate his wildly spiking. Within moments, the agonizing tremors began to fade. The phantom blade actively manipulated the kid's arteries, kicking his metabolic rate into hyperdrive, so his body could actively combat the punishing restriction. Having stabilized the rookie, the veteran silently turned his back. He muttered that tracking down a decent punching bag on this desolate peak was a rare treat. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Sung-min Lee knew for a fact he would be if these monsters had not stepped in. Ever since turning back the clock, his supporting cast had been shockingly merciful. Dwelling on that shift, a cold chill of suspicion crept in. The world was never this forgiving. From the moment he opened his eyes in the past, strangers had constantly handed him golden tickets that his previous life never saw. Further up the trail, Scarlet barked at the grizzled master, who was already wrinkling his nose at her toxic cloud from 50 paces away. She snapped at him, deeply offended that she was catching heat just for skipping the shower for a couple of days. The odd pair shifted the topic back to Sung-min Lee and the sheer amount of babysitting they were putting in. For a battle junkie who usually breathed nothing but swordplay, the veteran was currently sheltering the rookie with shocking devotion. And he was not the only softie. Scarlet had literally bled herself dry, crafting those arcane texts from scratch. Taking a step back, neither of these lone wolves could figure out why they were playing guardian angel. They just possessed this nagging gut feeling that letting him die was not an option. Meanwhile, Sung-min actively shoved those paranoid thoughts aside. In this second playthrough, he firmly decided to just shut up and enjoy his unbelievable streak of dumb luck. Fast forward 6 brutal months, and the young fighter clenched his polearm until his knuckles turned white. He remained buried deep within the treacherous woods, grinding endlessly in total isolation. His hollow eyes screamed pure exhaustion, yet tapping out was never in his vocabulary. Chilling nearby, a shadow mocked his pathetic struggles, branding him a miserable little maggot. But even that harsh critic was secretly blown away, openly admitting they never expected the kid to survive this long. The battered warrior remained firmly planted in the dirt. He kept his mouth totally shut. He had been ghosting this phantom heckler since day one. Honestly, it was highly likely he had triggered a silencing curse, willingly locking away his own voice at the 6-month milestone just to minimize distractions. Never shutting up, the relentless voice hammered away, claiming they fully expected Sung-min to intentionally stack the most lethal restrictions possible. In a flash, the spearman grounded his heavy weapon. The phantom spectator scrutinized his stance. This kid was a completely different beast compared to the fragile rookie from 6 months prior. His evasive footwork, core balance, and sheer fluidity were now sharp, surgical, and utterly lethal. The profound martial arts he absorbed from Baek So-go fit his The mysterious spectator scoffed, assuming even a pathetic grub could eventually sprout wings, if it just kept dragging itself through the dirt. Chuckling with malice, he sneered that groveling on the ground was the Sung-min tuned out the toxic venom, completely engrossed in his relentless grind. Finally snapping, the observer drew his blade. He angrily demanded to know why he was being treated like thin air, boasting that Sung-min's every flinch and twitch gave away his true thoughts anyway. Exhausted to his core, the young warrior sighed inwardly, wondering if this creep had literally zero hobbies. Make no mistake, though, he sensed the lethal aura dripping from the man. Still, a twisted sense of security grounded him. The absolute law of the mountain strictly forbade murder, meaning his life was technically safe. Suddenly, bam! A brutal strike slammed into him. The teenager crashed into the dirt, entirely blindsided by the blistering speed of the blow. His tormentor erupted into vicious laughter, mocking the pitiful sight of him squirming like a crushed insect. The bastard had actually discovered a loophole to inflict pain without breaking the sacred rule. Brandishing his gleaming blade, the man taunted that Sung-min could never replicate this feat. The weapon pulsed with raw, concentrated aura, a literal sword of ki. The vicious mocking continued, tearing into the boy's lack of talent. While Sung-min bled for every single inch of progress, monsters like him could effortlessly shatter those same barriers and ascend. Yet our hero simply bit down and pushed forward, leaving his abuser utterly stunned. In the eyes of the spectator, this path offered absolutely nothing. For a tragic soul cursed with zero natural talent, throwing his life away in endless training felt like a completely... But Sung-min fiercely refused to bow down. No matter how many agonizing years it demanded, he would drag his battered body forward, inch by grueling inch. Let the bastard choke on his own arrogance. Someday, Sung-min swore to plunge his spear straight through that smug elite chest. Ignoring the flashy display of power, the team kept his mouth shut. Instead, he channeled his boiling rage, sinking his spear violently into the battered tree trunk. The imposing man instantly decoded the silent, lethal promise radiating from the boy's strike. Standing tall, his aura felt like a crushing mountain. With a cold smirk, the tyrant finally backed off, declaring that if Sung-min truly believed his own hype, he would eagerly await the day they crossed blades for real. Our hero had zero intention of crumbling into dust right before the finish line. Flash forward 30 days, marking a grueling 365 days of sheer hell on the mountain for Lee Sung-min. Now the ultimate crossroads arrived, selecting his next curse. He boldly locked in the restriction of hearing, plunging himself into absolute psychological torture. Instantly, his eardrums were bombarded by a screeching. Burdened by 6 crushing penalties, the boy teetered on the razor's edge of death, 24/7. Yet his hands never stopped carving the air with his trusted spear. His refined footwork allowed him to slip past invisible attacks, plant his feet like steel roots, and deliver lethally precise thrusts. He relentlessly honed the legendary, supreme spear of the 9 heavens, fused it with the arcane Violet Dawn techniques, and mastered the ghostly, shadowless soul flight. Every brutal Scarlet unfortunately offered basically nothing to his explosive growth. Ironically, as Lee Sung-min's raw power surged, an invisible crushing weight settled deep into his bone. Rations turned into absolute ash in his mouth, while vicious nightmares violently shredded his sleep. The bone-deep, icy tremors practically paralyzed him at night. The screeching static echoing in his skull was agonizing, but it had one massive perk. It completely drowned out Flam's irritating, condescending trap. Scraping by bloody step, our resilient underdog forged genuine strength. Later, standing before the enigmatic Mush, he bluntly demanded to know why he had been abruptly summoned. Considering his next demonic curse was still weeks away, she simply met his gaze with a warm smile and applauded him for surviving the hidden trial. Totally baffled, the boy's mind drew an absolute blank. Out of nowhere, Flam materialized directly in his face, making the young warrior practically jump out of his own skin. Mush smoothly revealed that the arrogant loudmouth Flam was actually the living embodiment of the trial itself. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces violently locked into place. Legends like Baek Sogo Scarlet and Doko Jun had cemented their names as absolute titans across the entire realm of area. Yet the name Flam had never once popped. Wielding that terrifying level of godlike aura, there was absolutely no way that the mind-bending twist Flam was literally a phantom, an entity that never truly existed in the physical. The phantom smirked, explaining that his sole purpose was to weaponize his overwhelming ki, designed specifically to shatter the mental fortitude of aspiring martial artists. Even generational prodigies would take one look at his monstrous strength and spiral into a black hole of depression. They would lose their sanity and scramble down the mountain in pure terror. But our tenacious hero was built totally different. Stripped of any natural gifts, he willingly dived headfirst into the meat grinder, treating the phantom not as a nightmare, but as his ultimate prey. It was practically suicidal. Yet the ghost's relentless torment had completely failed to snap the boy's iron will. Ultimately, that sheer, unadulterated madness secured his victory. Mush issued a bone-chilling warning: leak Flam's true identity to the... Regardless of the terrifying threats, the young underdog locked his focus, dead set on surviving the brutal wilderness. The ultimate payout for surviving this psychological hellscape was put on layaway, waiting for him the moment he finally descended the peaks. The entity threw down a devil's bargain, offering a terrifying boost of strength, rivaling a century of sweat and blood, for the low price of his very soul. Lee Sung-min shot it down without skipping a beat. He vastly preferred to embrace the agonizing grind, carving out his power, drop by painful drop. This sheer defiance forced the teen into deep reflection about his own absolute limits. Deep down, he despised the concept of hard work. No matter how many buckets of sweat and blood he poured out, he perpetually lagged behind the golden children, blessed by the heavens. However, raw talent didn't give those prodigies a free pass to slack off. Ultimately, what truly disgusted him were the hypocrites who downplayed a massive genetic lottery by chalking it all up to... Ironically, he had practically weaponized the word grind since his previous miserable life, using that same bitter underdog mentality as his ultimate bulletproof armor. He'd been handed way too many miraculous second chances to keep crying about his unfair starting line. That pathetic safety net was completely shattered. Now his only option was to plow straight ahead. For the very first time, he was pouring his absolute soul into the grind. Despite the agonizing pain, Lee Sung-min swore he'd ride it out to the bitter end, simply because he wanted this. Seeing that raw determination, Mush's face lit up with a brilliant smile. Pivoting away, she casually asked if she could just think out loud for a second. In the world of area, she murmured, coincidences simply didn't exist. Every single event snapped into a grand, deliberate puzzle. This realm dragged in travelers from across dimensions and galaxies, yet the actual reason remained a massive, bleeding mystery. Listening closely, our hero caught on Mush wasn't just babbling to the wind. Her words were aimed right at his chest. She was slipping him classified intel she was strictly forbidden from saying out loud. The mysterious girl fell dead silent. If he had actually spun back time, it meant an apocalyptic threat was brewing, one that desperately demanded his regression. He had to harden himself, forging a weapon worthy of whatever cosmic force hurled him into the past. She wrapped up her little monologue with a cheerful grin, though deep anxiety flickered in her eyes. Throwing a single hand into the air, she fiercely claimed this turf as her own, warning an unseen intruder to back off, unless they craved absolute annihilation. Space itself began to splinter, jagged cracks, ripping wide open into gaping, pitch-black void. Completely lost in the chaos, our hero froze in his tracks until Moosh ordered him to retreat. He needed to finish his grueling training. Every ticking second counted. Before he could even spit out a response, she forcefully warped him away. Honestly, she had no clue if Lee Sung-min could block the incoming nightmare. He desperately needed to grasp the endgame waiting for him. Fast forward a few days, and he locked in his 6th brutal trial, the prohibition of smell. A suffocating stench radiating from Scarlett's hair ruthlessly assaulted his senses. Maybe nuking his own sense of smell was a massive mistake. Right then, a woman carrying an incredibly eerie vibe materialized by his side. But the trade-off was simple. The more torturous the restriction, the more explosive his power growth. So fighting through violent waves of nausea, he swallowed the... Nearby Baek Sogo was carrying the crushing burdens of lost taste and hearing. Stacked against her past traumas, this fresh hell felt suffocating. Stripping away her literal senses proved to be a far more brutal nightmare than she had ever anticipated. The young warrior perked up when she quietly mentioned she had something important to say. With a rock-solid tone, she dropped the bomb she was packing up and leaving the mountain. They locked eyes, a heavy, silent understanding passing between them. Let's be real, Baek Sogo never needed to subject herself to this torture. She was already cemented as a generational prodigy. 2 grueling years on this peak had pushed her past her ultimate limits. Stunned, our guy asked if she was actually walking away. She gave a firm nod. He, on the other hand, was stubbornly staying behind. A deep pang of sorrow flashed in her eyes, fully realizing their paths were finally splitting. Despite the painful goodbye, she confidently promised they'd cross paths again. Baek Sogo softly gazed at the young man she had bled alongside on this punishing cliff. The fragile kid she once knew had forged himself into an absolute beast, but her gut twisted with fear. If she left, he might fatally overdose on these lethal curses. He was riding dangerously close to the edge, making her seriously consider staying back just to master his training in shadowless soul flight. But Lee Sung-min gently cut her off, swearing he could hold his own. Thanks to her guidance, he had learned to eat the pain, and now he could carry his own massive weight. Pouring his heart out, he thanked her, openly admitting he'd be a corpse without her help. Hearing those raw words, a warm, radiant smile bloomed. Closing the gap, she pulled him into a tight, emotional embrace. Completely blindsided, he awkwardly stiffened before letting his iron defenses melt away. His hardened features finally softened, melting into her deeply genuine hug. Pulling back just an inch, Baek Sogo looked him in the eyes and called him the most unyielding fighter she'd ever encountered. The deeper she looked into his soul, the more she realized his drive wasn't the frantic He chuckled at that, confessing he had been completely shattered countless times. But he just refused to stay down. Totally awestruck, she called him incredible, confessing that watching him made her finally surrender her own fiery demons. Locking onto his gaze, she pleaded from the bottom of her heart, "Please don't die on me." Without missing a beat, he echoed the exact. He was going to survive no matter what. Soon after, Baek Sogo, Dokebi Jun, and Scarlet all packed up and vanished down the mountain. For the first time in years, a crushing wave of loneliness hit him. In his pathetic past life, he was a paranoid stray who trusted absolutely no one. But now, he finally understood that a man couldn't survive on an island. Without that loyal crew, his bones would already be dust. Standing perfectly still, he locked his eyes onto a bright streak tearing across. Something deep within his core violently shifted, shattering the steel vault around his heart. For one transcendent split second, all smell, weight, and sound completely. That fleeting taste of pure liberation felt like an eternity, totally warping the ordinary world around him. Just as his soul had been reborn, the entire universe felt completely rewritten. Searing summer finally rolled in, carried by the deafening roar of cicadas. Fast forward 7 years, and a grim fate awaits. Baek Sogo is destined to cross paths with Wijie Hoyun in the cold depths of a dungeon, only to meet a brutal end at her hands. Driven by a fierce need to repay her past kindness, he vowed to shatter that tragic timeline. He lashed out, stomping at a nearby insect, but the elusive cicada slipped right through his grasp. Much like a cicada burying itself in the dirt for 10 long years before breaking the surface, he had exactly 7 years to avert this incoming catastrophe. Whether he evolved into an unstoppable force or fell short, it didn't matter. His martial prowess sharpened with each passing dawn, yet the progress felt agonizingly slow. Craving absolute power, he pushed his body past the breaking point, completely abandoning sleep to relentlessly drill his. Navigating the world completely blind wasn't some mystical secret. To survive the suffocating void of his stolen vision, he hyper-focused his remaining senses, etching every single inch of the rocky terrain. As absolute darkness swallowed his reality, Lee Sung-min clung to the rough sensation of touch as his only lifeline. After one grueling week, he finally managed to creep forward, anchored purely by the faint echoes cutting through the pitch-black abyss. Slowly, those hollow noises morphed. Hypnotized by that sound, he endlessly thrust his spear, completely losing his grip on the flow of time. Muscle memory took over, and his body flawlessly executed deadly martial arts forms. His mind sank into a profound trance. Much like a fragile larva desperately yearning to break free as a winged cicada, his soul hungered for